For 60 years, the rivalry between the Bearcats of Monroe High School and the Turks of Sultan High School was one of the most beloved and classic of football rivalries in the Sky River Valley. With the towns only separated by less than 12 miles, it was a natural rivalry for the people of both communities to enjoy annually. Though it was largely not a competitive rivalry, the games brought the two small towns close together, and occasionally produced some classic matchups on the gridiron. This series went on for decades until 1978, when the last game was played. Since then, the rivalry has become little more than a footnote in local history. But what is the history behind this old rivalry game? What are the key moments that live on in the minds of the old-timers that remember those games? This is the story of the Battle of the Valley. The histories of Monroe and Sultan are closely intertwined, as both towns were settled and incorporated at around the same time, in 1902 and 1905 respectively. People from both towns worked in similar jobs like logging, dairy, and agriculture, oftentimes working with one another. Historically, Sultan has always been the smaller town compared to its older, larger counterpart Monroe, setting up the perfect climate for a rivalry. The first game in the series took place in 1918, getting the rivalry off to an inauspicious start. Monroe easily won the game, defeating Sultan 30-0 in the first and last game of the season. During this time, the Spanish flu was sweeping through western Washington, with cases being discovered in nearby cities. To keep the people safe, an order was issued in Monroe that barred any public gatherings, ending the football season for both teams. When the series resumed in 1920, Monroe dominated Sultan as the Bearcats racked up huge wins in almost every matchup for the next 20 years. By 1940, Monroe had rung up a record of 16 wins and only 2 losses and 1 tie against the lowly Sultan team. Despite the yearly mismatch, the game was always highly anticipated in both towns and drew large crowds of spectators each year. Despite the early history of success, Monroe faltered in the 1940s, and the Sultan Turks began their ascent in the series. The 1940s proved to be a tumultuous decade for the Monroe Bearcats, as the program went through 6 different coaches over the 10-year span. The Turks took advantage of this instability and were able to pay back the Bearcats in a few decisive victories. Once thought of as a sure victory in Monroe, the Sultan game became a competitive matchup each and every single season. As the decade turned to the 1950s, the Turks continued to grow into a powerful team, entering into a golden age of Sultan football that lasted throughout the first half of the decade. Now with some stability, the Bearcats also rose to prominence, ushering in a brief period where both teams were equally matched. The games took on a new character as championship hopes lived and died on the final score. In 1950, Sultan went into the game against Monroe with an undefeated league record and tied for first place. A win guaranteed the share of the league title, while defeat could ruin the season. Well out of the title race, Monroe rallied against their rivals and edged them out in a close 13-12 victory, spoiling Sultan's perfect record and title hopes. In 1952, the Bearcats assembled their best team of the decade and were running through their opponents with ease. Monroe had state title hopes in mind, but disaster soon struck midway through the season. An early matchup with Sultan ended disastrously, as the Turks whipped the Bearcats by a score of 20-0. This one loss ruined the season, and even though the Bearcats won out the rest of the year, this defeat ended any chance for a state title. In 1955, the Bearcats had another opportunity to play spoiler, as Sultan came to town needing only one more victory to cap off an undefeated season. Despite Monroe's best efforts, the Turks, powered by their massive fullback Vern LaBelle, pulled out a victory and celebrated their unblemished season in front of a massive Monroe audience. The 1955 season was the zenith of Sultan football, as the balance of power shifted back to Monroe for the rest of the decade and beyond. Though the rivalry had reached an exciting peak during the first half of the 1950s, the beginning of the end for this age-old rivalry was soon coming. The first signs of trouble for the future of the rivalry began in the late 1950s, as Monroe and Sultan were no longer classified in the same league. With league play against each other ended, both schools continued to play against each other, but it quickly became apparent that the rivalry became a huge mismatch once again. After an era of success, the Sultan Turks began their steady decline into mediocrity. In 1960, Sultan defeated Monroe for the first time in 5 years. Little did anyone know that this was the peak of Sultan's success against Monroe for the rest of the decade. After this, the Bearcats ripped off an impressive 12-game winning streak against the Turks in a display of dominance that far exceeded any other period in the series. In fact, from the 5 games between 1962 and 1966, Monroe did not allow Sultan to score a single point in any of the games, Sultan finally got a break from the streak as both teams did not play each other in 1971 or 1972, the first time there hadn't been a game between the schools since 1931. With no games against Monroe for 2 seasons, Sultan once again experienced a brief rise in their football program. After going 5-4 in 1970, the Turks finished with an 8-1 record in 1971, and then went a perfect 9-0 in 1972. Sultan had racked up a 14-game winning streak, while Monroe languished with a couple of mediocre seasons. In 1973, a game between the two teams was set to be played on the Sultan home field, and the hype for the game reached levels not seen since the golden days of the 1950s. A young Kirk Pearson, who was going to Monroe at the time, remembered the build-up before the game, saying,
I remember Monroe playing up at Sultan, and they had this tiny field, but it was just tons of people around. And it was such a cool rivalry. It was like a equivalent of maybe a small bowl game or something like that, the Monroe-Sultan game. That was early in the season, and just all these people, the Sultan guys, want to bet here, want to bet there. And so there was a lot of pride. It was community pride.
Between 2,000 and 2,500 fans packed into Gibson Field to witness a tight defensive battle as Monroe and Sultan remained tied at 6-6 until the third quarter, when Bearcat running back Keith McDaniel scored the game-winning touchdown and the Bearcat defense held on to win 12-6, snapping Sultan's 14-game winning streak. The following year, Monroe stretched its winning streak up to 12 games, but the mid-'70s saw another decline in the strength of Bearcat football, and Sultan was quick to capitalize on it. The Turks finally snapped the streak in 1975, beating Monroe 13-6, and followed up this victory by winning the next 2 out of 3 games against Monroe. In 1978, Monroe and Sultan played their final rivalry game at the Monroe Field. The plucky Sultan team pulled out another victory against the Bearcats by a score of 18-12 in what is still the last game played between the two teams. In the years that followed, Monroe moved up to the 3A classification, making the gap between Monroe and Sultan too big to continue the series. As the Monroe population exploded in the 1990s, the Bearcats moved up to 4A, while Sultan still resides in single A. While it is doubtful that the two schools will play against each other anytime soon, there have been encouraging signs recently. Monroe has gone down to 3A, and the population in Sultan has been steadily increasing since the 2000s. Time will tell if and when the series is resurrected, but for now, all that is left are the memories of the Battle of the Valley.